tier list is closer to art and science and reflects the author's opinions. I value decks by ease of execution as well as their abstract strengths. I value mediocre decks with high roll potential above decks that are just a worse something else. Welcome to our first tier, decks that win tournaments. These decks are both strong and easy to play, or strong enough to make up for being harder to play. This is the deck that the format is named after. It's extremely good. Good early plays and insane plays given even a modicum of setup. You can play all the best cards, including Tour Guide, Reborn Tengu, and Void of the Beginning, the entire plant engine, and actually more than a quarter of all limited spells. Unlike the evolution of most decks in retro Yu-Gi-Oh!, Tengu has stayed quite close to Billy Brake's original incarnation from more than 10 years ago, and you could conceivably pick up his exact deck and not raise any eyebrows. Ironically enough, I'd say the deck has more flexibility than many other decks, with between 4 and 10 slot being completely malleable, depending on which cards you consider to be replaceable. The choices you do make matter a lot as well, giving a distinct shape to every Tengu deck. In addition to being so customizable in construction, it's also flexible and fluid during gameplay. Few decks offer so many different legitimate lines and opportunities to second guess every choice when spectating or watching your own replay. Almost every hand has 2 great options as well as secondaries with high risk or lower reward. Out of all established decks, Tengu Plant is the hardest and most rewarding to pilot. When playing a tournament, you will face Tengu Plant, not because it always wins, but because your opponent will have a blast playing it. I would recommend every player interested in the format to pick up this deck at least once to learn the weaknesses and strengths, because in a way the format does revolve around this deck even though it's not overbearing. The strengths that the deck does have are very indicative of what is strong in this format, such as the interaction between 1-for-1 and Reborn Tengu, Envoy of the Beginning and Armory Arm, as well as Formula Synchro and TG Hyper Librarian. Furthermore, the deck has no bad matchups. Some people may claim that it does, but they're wrong. The deck can't be easily hated out, as no side deck card hits all the angles that this deck attacks from. Cards like DD Crow and Max C attack on an angle that the deck doesn't have to fight on. The deck plays Envoy of the Beginning, Thunder King Ryo, and occasional Caius the Shadow Monarch, all of which are immune to those kind of interactions. Such is the strength of playing Pseudo Highlander with only the best cards available. Is the deck unbeatable then? Well, obviously no. In addition to being, as earlier mentioned, difficult to play, you can't rely on standardized lines, and even worse, your deck has counter synergy with itself. Goldfish a few hands and you'll open 2 Tengus, Envoy, Debris, and 2 non-engine or otherwise mismatched spell traps. Those hands, and even some that are slightly better, can be slow or setup reliant, which can spell doom, especially facing another faster deck or something that opened better than you did. Backtracking a bit to Maxi, Vader, and Crow, getting hit with them at an unopportune moment can set you back significantly, and the same goes for cards like Nobleman of Crossout, Chain Disappearance, and other random stuff like Rivalry of Warlords. I do, however, still believe Tengu Plant is less vulnerable to these haymakers due to its breadth of play and multiple disparate engine pieces. Another weak point of the deck is running out of engine pieces late game. This is due to Glow Up, Bulb, and Spore, and to a lesser extent Reborn Tengu being limited amount of uses you can have of them per game. Therefore, it is usually in your best interest to attempt to finish the game early. Good Tengu players typically play very aggressively with their once per duel plants, going Librarian into Catastrophe for the massive life point swing. This isn't Agents where you have 10 boss monsters, nearly all of yours are limited and your deck will be left as a pile unless you drop out of Avarice, which always feels like sacking here due to the insane value it provides. In the words of J4, it's plus inf. While I think the extra deck space problem is overstated in most Tengu Plant decks, you still only have basically 2 flex spots to work with due to needing both dragons for Debris, as well as exist monsters plus those that you just need to be able to make, such as Armor Arm, Formula Synchro, and Librarian itself. While not really a weakness per se, I mean you are playing the best extra deck cards after all. It's harder to fit auxiliary cards like Chimera Tech, Colossal Fighter, Thought Ruler Archfiend, or Steelform Roach, which gives you a certain level of predictability. This matters because unlike most other decks, you can realistically make these cards if you would need to every game. Enough words about Tengu Plant? I sure hope so let's look at the deck list. While the deck provider does not play any really that uncommon cards, I think that Caius in itself needs an explanation of why it is played in this deck. After all, one of the biggest reasons you do lose is drawing less playable hands. Caius is a very good card. It's one of the most efficient ways to convert resources into actual advantage. It puts pressure on your opponent for little investment and forces out answers such as Effect Veiler or Solemn Warning that would be better served for your other cards. In simplified game states, few cards can match the impact of Caius, which outs everything from Sangan to Stardust Dragon. My bias is showing here. My personal version of Tengu Plants does play 3 Caius, the full playset, which admittedly will be brick sometimes, which is why this version only includes the single copy. Chaos Sorcerer is not an uncommon inclusion, but something that I personally think makes the deck a lot better, attacking from a different angle being a second lesser envoy of the beginning. It is quite common in its format to overload on all the good normal summons that exist, so just being something that you can special summon from your hand at will adds a lot of value. Both Chaos and Chaos Sorcerer being level 6 monsters open up lines which you would otherwise not see with synchro summoning. Banishing monsters in general is also something that's very strong right now in my opinion. If it's so good, then why are we not playing additional copies? Well, I think the easiest answer is that you can break, and the second answer is that you have a very limited amount of lights and darks in your deck that you can comfortably banish, especially early game. You're usually fine drawing one Chaos monster, as you can synchro summon into both a light and a dark, preferably formula into Librarian, and then banish those to summon your Chaos monster, but that only goes for one use of them. I could definitely see a version with multiples, perhaps with triple Vader or Lightstone monsters to up both the count of main deck light monsters as well as virtual darks via the mill effects. At least for me, that version purely exists on the drawing board right now. Something that usually goes as an unquestioned standard is a 2 to maxi Vader split. I'm not here to criticize that exact ratio, but to explain why I ended up with that after being on 3 Vader 1 maxi for the longest time. Vader is a light, and the typical Tengu Plant deck runs 4 lights excluding Envoy proper, making your Chaos monster resolution heavily reliant on resolving either Sangon or Formula Synchron. Two things that won't happen if you're getting shut down, which takes away a big portion of how unfair Envoy can actually be. I'd also say that currently Vader has greater utility against more decks than maxi. Especially against heroes, agents, Catsy from rogue decks, Vader is superior. Vader is also a 1-for-1 target. Beyond the obvious scope of its own effect, Maxi can realistically only be used with the Breed Dragon and Pot of Avarice. So why the 2-2 split then? There's two primary reasons. First of all, by not playing Maxi you give up an edge in the mirror where Maxi is at its strongest. Further, it's better to have one of each in your hand rather than two of the same, which is weighed against having the better one more often. Following the same reasoning I use running 2 MSDs and 1 Lance in most of my decks. I would not fault anyone for going 3 Vader regardless of the amount of Maxi in the main deck, but as previously stated, be aware that you're giving up percentage in the mirror match by removing Maxi entirely. Linked to the issue of lights is the usage of Thunder King Ryo in the main deck. While perhaps an obvious auto-include to most people, I dislike how poorly it matches up against Venus and to a lesser extent Turn 1 Tour Guide. By cutting it entirely, you're very much giving up an edge in the mirror match and against TGs though. The nightmare scenario is your opponent knowing you're not on Ryo, allowing you to freely summon Sangon throughout the game. You're also hard pressed to find better lights than this. It is Veiler, Ryo or bust. There's actually one more light, a level 2 flip monster. My personal list runs Raikou over Ryo because it beats opposing Ryo while sometimes advancing your game with random mills, as well as matching up significantly better against Venus and sometimes outing a troublesome card such as Christia or Macrocosmos. I've yet to test enough to decide if we're going to claim that it's just strictly better, because Raikou lacks the impact and simplified game state that Ryo can have by preventing their plays entirely. In obvious addendum, Ryo is better versus TG, Zombie, Gadget or other decks where Ryo's main value is in stopping searches rather than summons. The plant engine of 4 cards plus the honorary plant, the Breed Dragon, are auto-includes, and I don't think they should be questioned. However, there's one more plant that's slightly worthy of consideration, and that of course is the venerable Mystic Tomato. Before I discuss Tomato, let me state that I do not think Titania, Lord Poison or the like are worthy of consideration. Puppet Plant could be main decked given the right meta and has some niche applications, but is primarily a side deck card. The primary draw for a Mystic Tomato is that it gives you an additional target for Lonefire Blossom, which attacks over Tour Guide and also allows a potential level 5 spore later in the game. If running Tomato, you'd likely want a second good target for its effect beyond Sangan, such as Spirit Reaper or Blackwing Gale the Whirlwind. This is also the biggest argument against Mystic Tomato in my opinion, the fact that it requires more than one slot to effectively use. So Tomato not recommended. Conversely, if cutting a card, it would definitely be Lonefire Blossom. Lonefire Blossom does not have the best conversion unless you already have monsters on the field, as the best thing you can do is summon a defense position Dandelion. However, using Lonefire Blossom with a monster on the field is better than normal summoning Spore, as the interaction between them is greater than the sum of their parts. I would not seriously consider excluding it. So what about removing the Breed Dragon? On the surface, it seems like the weakest link is it puts a somewhat significant restriction on your extra deck, more on that later, and is one of the 2 plants along with Spore that doesn't do anything without setup. I think the payoff and especially the interaction with Dandelion into Trishula is more than enough to make it worth. It having 2000 defense is also relevant, especially early game in the face of opposing Venus, Ryo and Tengu. Once again, I would not seriously consider removing this card. Something that is non-standard and optional is Scapegoat. I think Scapegoat is super strong. It has great synergy with the Breed Dragon, Spore and Enemy Controller. It basically acts like extra on-demand Dandelion tokens. It's usually good both early and late. When not expected, it can thwart an aggressive play by mimicking Battle Fader. It has some downsides, which includes being worse than Spirit Reaper and Enemy Controller in some situations, those being the card it has the most overlap with. Don't forget the tokens cannot be tributed for a tribute summon. This version only runs 1 copy of Enemy Controller. Econ is a really good card and I could see myself playing upwards of 3 copies. Space is the biggest enemy, with the second being that unlike some other strong cards in this deck, Econ doesn't do much by itself. When your deck is already loaded with great 2 card combos, the need for additional such lines lessen. For me personally, second Econ is my 41st card, as a figure of speech. Note that I do not condone running more than 40 cards. Any deck that plays 41 cards will be better factor of playing 40 cards. Playing 41 cards do not appreciably decrease the amount of times you will see multiple Tengus in the same hand. 41 cards will decrease the amount of times you see Evo at the beginning, Trap Dust Shoot, and Monster Reborn. This is not worth it at all. It will never be. Always run 40 cards. For a last word on Econ, siding a second copy is not out of the question. The Paprika has seen success with the tactic before. I personally don't see when you would bring it in, which is why it's not featured in the side deck here. The Singleton MST in the main deck is primarily a concession to side deck space. Do note that I think that MST is superior to Forbidden Lands in almost every situation for this deck, since so many of your monsters gain value against traps, barring summon negations. Anyway, you're primarily gunning for opposing continuous and field cards or the aforementioned summon negations. Paradoxically to your cards being relatively trap immune, they're also typically so high value that I wouldn't be opposed to additional MSTs. I can see legitimate versions running anywhere from 0 to 3 copies in the main deck, an additional example of how flexible this deck can be. I do think you should have at least 2 copies between main and side combined, at the very least. Finally, it's worth mentioning that if you're primarily concerned with playing through back rows, having additional monsters that can summon themselves might be better. They force the card rather than destroy it, and are better than MST when the opponent doesn't have such an answer. Your realistic choices for cards that fit the bill is very scarce, so I don't see that as an actual option for this specific deck, compared to, let's say, agents or zombies. I play Mirror Force in all my decks. I know some people think it's undesirable or worse yet, inferior to Dimensional Prison. I think Mirror is good enough to include in almost any trap lineup. Prison, banishing the monster is often relevant, but there's a key factor that makes me lean towards Mirror. It can hit multiple monsters. While obvious, the effect in practice is that you won't have a random tour guide hit you for 1k or what have you. Life points matter. Also, if your opponent does ignore Mirror or knows you don't play it, you're at a disadvantage which crafty opponents can exploit. Prison's advantage is being a better out versus cards that the opponent want to have in grave, including anything from a random light to Sangan. The last option is to run no battle traps, which is good for space but not much more. After all, Mirror Force is an additional mass removal card which is basically unconditional. The fact that not everyone plays it nowadays works as a mirror to the earlier argument. If they think you don't run it, gaining value with it is easier. The last non-standard card in the deck is Call of the Haunted. Most Tengu Plant decks run between 6 and 8 traps. Among those, the most commonly seen that are not featured in this list is Compulsory Vacation Device and Bottomless Trap Hole. I choose Call because it along with Trap Dust Shoot punishes opponents, dropping random MSTs on you. Call has high value late in the game, as per usual, but in Tengu you have the added benefit of returning a Tengu hit by warning or a Sangan attached from Leviathan among other things, making it more likely to be live early. It is by far the brickiest card in the deck though, and probably my first cut if I needed to add something in. Unlike most other decks, I do not really want a second copy but would rather prefer a defensive trap. If played at 2 copies, any hand that wasn't godlike with 2 in it would likely be unplayable. The extra deck is of great importance to a Tengu Plant deck. With the great flexibility in lines for Synchro and Exceed monsters, concessions have to be made. I'd say the extra deck provided is almost as standard as it gets. The 2 cards that are, in my opinion, flex spots are Ancient Fair Dragon along with Arcanite Magician and potentially number 39 Utopia. I do not think running an extra deck Chimera tech is worth given the flexibility you have. So, why Arcanite Magician and Ancient Fair Dragon? If your opponent does not have a response to a Formula Librarian play, they will likely not have an answer to Arcanite either. Chaos plus Bulb is also a realistic line into Arcanite. Being a light monster that you aren't looking to make again after Avarice is also relevant. Nevertheless, Arcanite Magician is probably the first card you should drop if you want to fit something else. Ancient Fair Dragon is a second level 7 dragon that matches well up against rogue decks, for which breaching the 3000 defense can be a Herculean task. While it could be sided instead, it has enough utility game 1 and side deck space is precious enough that I'm comfortable playing it in the extra. Destroying field spells every turn when backed up with a defensive card is something that Black Rose cannot mimic. It also just so happens to be light. The first effect, to summon from hand, also has uses. Most common is probably bridging from Debris Dandy into Trishula by summoning a level 1 tuner. I think the deck needs to run a level 6 dragon monster, whether that be Iron Chain Dragon or Orient Dragon. Iron Chain Dragon is a solid option since it can beat most early game monsters in Crash Leviathan Dragon, however its inability to get over stronger monsters and its inability to generate advantage by itself is something that makes me stay away from it. The fact that milling your opponent can generate advantage for them in both the mirror and other matchups is also a very negative trait. We'd need to see a significant meta shift for me to recommend Iron Chain Dragon over Orient Dragon. I do, however, think that you need a level 6 dragon and you shouldn't leave home without it. Some Tengu Plant lists run Steals from Roach in addition to or instead of Utopia. I think Utopia's higher attack is more valuable since Leviathan exists. While Roach can knock your opponent out occasionally, you typically go for a rank 4 play to counter the Ryo, Tengu or similar, not because you aim to make a rank 4. It's not a crime to run Roach, but without a radically different approach to the metagame, I'd say Utopia is always the superior choice. The last commonly run extra deck monster I'm not running is a 3rd level 8, typically Colossal Fighter, but sometimes Red Dragon Archfiend or Thought Ruler Archfiend. Simply put, you do not make them enough. Colossal has a niche versus Honest, Skildian and Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. None of those situations come up enough given that his states are hand are not common and your lines into it are rarer still. Since Colossal Armor of Decay no longer works, it lost most of its luster in my eyes. Red Dragon is good versus opposing tokens, Raikus and random recruiters, plus it can be made via Debris Dragon. dragon. Most of the time you'd rather be making scrap or stardust, so it's quite limited in scope. Thus, while good in vastly different situations from Colossal, it's likely to end up unused all the same. Thought Ruler is good when you need life or warning or when you think they have compulsory or prison, not worth. Okay, it has additional utility, but I think it's by far the worst choice for an additional 8. For the other cards you could potentially run, it's the same story. Not a dragon, no impact will never make. This includes Magical Android, Trident, Dragon, Gaia Knight and more. If anything, go for Colossal or Roach. The side deck is very malleable and should be adjusted based on what you think you'll be facing in your particular tournament run. Nevertheless, it's hard to get by without citing some amount of hand traps. I think TD Crow covers most matchup where you do not want either Veiler or Maxi, hence it gets the nod. The third Veiler is primarily for Catsif. Running a third Maxi is never a bad idea, I just didn't feel the need during testing to ever side into it. The matchup where it shines the most is in the mirror, but you already have DD Crow for that. Crow being a dark also comes up, especially if you want to side out Chaos or Sorcerer. Puppet Plant is primarily for heroes, but also has potential utility when facing Chaos decks, as it can steal a mid-game Sorcerer Envoy. Electric Virus is both great versus Dragoonity and a concession to not playing any Chimera tech in a machine-based matchup. Kyko is one of the few cards that can really put in work versus Chaos, and to a lesser extent Catsif, provided you can actually connect. With the deck being so heavy on good normal summons already, it's hard to justify more than a single copy, and it overlaps with TD Crow. It is, however, one of my favorite cards, and it has tested well enough for me to recommend it. The side deck contains no copies of Leeching Delight. While good, I think the card is overrated. You won't get maximum value unless you already control multiple monsters. If you do, you're likely already winning. Side deck choices should be focused on winning matches, not steal games where you can already perform. It's hard not to justify one copy of Closed Forest as is good both when drawn and can be searched. It's very strong against decks relying on field spells. Additional MSTs are not an uncommon sight in side decks, and as earlier stated, I think it's better than lands here. I believe System Down is better than Chimertic here, not only due to the ever-present issue of space, but because Tengu Plant has a harder time resolving Cyber Dragons due to the deck often leaving stray Torgates, tokens or Tengus on the field. The life point cost is not something to overlook, but I think the Paprika has shown the value of the card. Finally, hitting Machina Fortress already in the graveyard is quite nice. And yes, I'll keep calling it Machina, not Machina, as the Japanese archetype is machiners and is not a reference to the term Deus Ex Machina or whatever counter argument you'd toss my way. Compulsory is in some ways a luxury, but without it you have no way to clean out early extra deck monsters without setup, and as such is a great tempo play. Maining it is not out of the question, but it's not particularly strong versus decks like Agent or Catsif that rely more on main deck boss monsters than do an extra deck. As such, I think it fits better in the side deck. D-Bank is a mediocre and also somewhat overrated card in my opinion. Most of the time it does not do what you want. It is one of the few answers to hand traps though, and not running it at all leaves you at the mercy of your opponent bringing in tons of hand traps. If you didn't already know, debunking a card that activates in hand and sends itself to your graveyard as cost does not banish it, making it less useful versus Chaos than it might seem at first. Debunk is typically at its best when you're already ahead, especially ahead on board, which goes against my idea of side deck choices. For these reasons and more, it's limited to a single copy in my side deck. I think the ability to run Royal Decree is one of the strengths of Tengu Plant. For those uninitiated, you do not need to cut all traps nor flip Decree first end phase possible to use it, although sometimes you will want to. Decree punishes trap heavy decks for not keeping MST, it can trade with most traps barring counter traps. Your engine is typically stronger than theirs, so you should win in a head-to-head fight. Given your ease of access to Black Rose and Scrap Dragon, it's not uncommon to destroy your own Decree at some point, now greatly ahead. In my opinion, Royal Decree is one of the best cards in the format, and Tengu Plant being able to run it greatly contributes to its strength. Out of all cards in the side deck except MST, this is the one I'd cut last. This is already getting long enough, but before I call it, let's go over some cards that did not quite make the cut. The most glaring omission here is Spirit Reaper. It's a debris target, a dark, a solid standalone card that applies pressure and can help set up Chaos or rank 3s. Despite being a zombie aficionado, I do not like Spirit Reaper. It's an additional normal summon that doesn't do much unless you're either winning or losing in a very specific way. I wouldn't raise any eyebrows at seeing it ran, but it's not a card I will ever include. Something uncommon I do like is playing Pot of Duality main deck. Jaina Ego recently topped the VCQ with 3 Duality main deck. All decks, even special summon reliant ones, have turns they can resolve it. The biggest argument against, in my opinion, are the virtual dead cards you will have due to Tengu and the Plant engine, especially early game where you are the most under pressure. Conversely, if you have a debris or envoy line late game, it will be a dead top deck. Duality is at its strongest mid game, yeah, what's new? I do think it matters more here than usual though, as Tengu usually wins very early or grinds out late. Despite how it looks, this is not a mid-range deck. I feel this is the strongest argument against Duality, if not the only one. The last common thing I'm not on is 41 cards. As already stated, don't do it. That's it for Tengu Plant. Have fun!